Okay, so as you know, William Worden is the author of our textbook. And this is the 5th edition. In reading it, you probably see that, yes, there needs to be a 6th edition because of this was 2016 and all of the changes from the DSM and then the DSM-5 TR. So all that has to be updated, but this was the version when I took this class. Skinny little version like that. So he's done a lot more research, and there's been a lot of changes, but this model I think is one that is that works particularly from a social work point of view, because it shows that mourning is an active rather than a passive activity, tasks, and so tasks connote that there is action or work required. So Worden's Task of Mourning gives us, as we saw, briefly last time in our perusal of a lot of different models that you probably have at least looked at the slides or listened to the lecture, but his model gives us a way of understanding how someone adapts to a loss. He has the 4 tasks, but they're not addressed in any order, but it does follow sort of a progression. But just like in other models, you can go from task 1 to task 2 and then find yourself back at task 1 again. And then, as I said, the tasks require effort, like Lindemann's grief work. So the first task is to accept the reality of the loss, and that might seem like a pretty simplistic thing, but it isn't always. And we saw when we were looking at common and normal grief reactions that shock is one of the most normal and most common reactions when someone, particularly if it's an unexpected death, but even when a death is anticipated, someone may experience a feeling of shock or disbelief. And so the first task is to be able to accept that your loved one has passed away, has died. And Lindemann and Worden talk about how the funeral is a very important part of completing task 1, because it helps that person to accept the reality of what's going on. And sometimes if someone is having trouble with that, if there is no funeral, I had a student from Africa, and she was not able to be at home or get home when her father died. And she said, I know in my head that he's gone, but it's really hard for me to really process the reality of it because I didn't see the body. I hadn't seen him get sick and die, and I wasn't at the funeral. So that task is sometimes more complex than we would at first think. But task 1 is we have to accept that our loved one has died. Task 2 then is to process the pain of that grief, to go through all of the painful feelings that one might feel after someone has died. You'll be watching this week and commenting on the discussion board a video of the psychologist who's talking about that in more depth, about what that could mean to really just get into and go through and process the pain. But according to Worden, and according to many of those that we looked at last week, the models, it is essential that we experience all of that pain. And I think experiencing that pain is also part of accepting the reality of the loss. So there is some overlap on the tasks. Task 3 is to adjust to a world without the deceased. And there's many components to that. In our text, you saw that, or you will see that Niedermeyer and his concept of meaning making, when we're talking about a death, this is the task in which that meaning making would take place. What does that look like externally? How is my life different? I have to do different things now, maybe take on different responsibilities because my loved one is gone. If it's a spouse, they might have been the one that did the finances or did the cleaning or laundry or whatever. You might have to learn new skills. They may be the one that coached the games for the kids or took them to school. So there may be all of these external adjustments that you have to do, and then internal adjustments. Who am I if I am not this person's spouse? Who am I if I am not the caregiver for my loved one who was sick and dying? Who am I without this person, essentially? So those are the internal ones. And then spiritually, what does that mean for my view of the world, for my view of, what makes meaning in the world? What is my belief about how things happen? Do all things, or is the world a benevolent place, or is it a darker place? And so how does this loss link me to the things that are greater than myself? So there's the internal, the external, and the spiritual. And in this processing too, many people do have sort of what one might call a crisis of faith, a spiritual crisis. If they feel like, everything happens for a reason. Well, what was this reason? Why did this happen? Did I do something? Does God hate me? Is there a God? So people that come from a spiritual background, people of faith, may find comfort and solace in that, but also may be, at least temporarily, in a place of turmoil and trying to figure out where they go from here. And that's all the processing that happens in this task 3. And then task 4, as stated in our most recent textbook, is to find a way to remember the deceased while embarking on the rest of one's journey through life. In other models and in other iterations of Worden's book, even, he talked about how to reframe or rename your relationship with the deceased while still moving forward with your life. So many of the models that we saw and earlier models of Worden's work talked about, sort of putting aside your loved one and then embarking on the rest of your life. And the more research that was done, the more research that Worden did, even, he noticed that people who exhibited healthy grieving also were able to maintain in some way a relationship with their loved one. It wasn't a physical, it was a relationship with the absence of the physical presence of their loved one. And so when you think about your own grief journeys, and I think about mine, I still have a relationship with my parents, and sometimes I even talk with them, but I'm still, embarking on new relationships. I'm still able to function in my life, and that, it's been a healthy thing for me. It's a recognition that everyone who has crossed your path, everyone that has been dear to you and has died, has left their mark on your life. And so you carry them with you rather than you're setting them aside and moving on without them. You carry them with you. And in this task, you're figuring out how that works. And for many of us, this is a lifelong journey. And it will look different in different stages of your life. Just like your relationship with your mom or your dad or someone else may have been different when you were 10 than when you were 20 or 30. Your relationship with your deceased loved ones is going to be different when you have different milestones in your life. So it is a lifelong journey, but it's also being able to maintain that relationship as you move forward with your life in a healthy way. So those are the 4 tasks. And so, but as we've seen in the models and in some of the discussions of preliminary discussions about grieving, everybody grieves in a different way. Everybody has a different style. Everyone's grief, even from death to death in the same person, is going to be it's going to be different. And why is that? How do we explain that? And in attempting to explain that, Worden came up with what he calls the mediators of mourning. And that doesn't mean that it's not like it's not mediator in what you think of. You're trying to lessen or negotiate, your grief reactions. It's really just a way of understanding why different people grieve differently, and people grieve differently for different types of losses. So here are his mediators of mourning. The first one is, of course, who died. Was it someone who was older? Was it someone who was younger? Is it someone who was a grandparent? What was your relationship with them? Is it someone who is a teacher? Is it a famous person? A few weeks ago, we watched as millions of people around the world mourned for a woman that they had never met. But she was something remarkable in their lives, for better or for worse. And so, there's all sorts of people that we mourn for every day. And the way that we mourn is influenced by who they are and who they were and how they influenced us. Mediator 2 is the nature of your attachment with that person. We've learned about attachment styles: avoidant, fearful, avoidant, secure, anxious. But what was the nature of your attachment with that particular person? Was it a strong one or a weak one? Was it one that you were, constantly afraid of losing? Was it ambivalent? Were there strong feelings for and strong feelings against? Was there a lot of conflict? And was there a dependent relationship, or, as we hear a lot in popular parlance, a codependent relationship? So what that attachment, we talked about last week, the importance of attachment theory when we're talking about grief and mourning, and this is why, because it directly affects how we are able to mourn and how we are able to move forward in our mourning grieving process. Mediator 3 is how that person died. There's the NASH categories. NASH is natural, accidental, suicide, or homicide. And there's another category that I guess doesn't fit with the acronym, but it's undetermined. So you may have someone who is, either we never did find out what exactly caused their death. It's ambiguous, or that person, is presumed dead but missing. But how that person died is going to affect, how we are grieving them and how we handle our grieving process. If it was a sudden death, if it was a violent death, how close were we physically to that person when they died? If it was a car accident, were we in the car? Did we see the accident? And the same with other kinds of violent deaths. Multiple losses. If someone has had many people die all at once, we saw that at Uvalde, and other times where maybe whole families are killed in a car accident, or several family members, like our president had, I believe, 3 family members who died in a single car accident. Or multiple losses could be serial losses, 3, 4, 5 losses within 6 months or a year or 2 years. Things that we may consider as preventable deaths. For instance, something to do with medical malpractice or accidents, drunk driving, those kinds of things, or, overdoses, things like that. Ambiguous deaths, like we just talked about, and stigmatized deaths. So an example of a stigmatized death may be, suicide, certainly is seen as stigmatized in our society. Also certain deaths, from HIV, or if someone was the drunk driver in an accident, then his death may, and especially if someone else was killed in that person's death may be, the drunk driver his death may be a stigmatized death as well. So mediator 4 is historical antecedents. What is your experience with death and grief and loss before? Because as our text says, if you've had trouble, if you've had complex reactions to deaths in the past, you're likely to have them going forward with deaths currently. So previous grief experiences and previous losses are somewhat predictive of losses, subsequent losses. If you have a history of mental illness, and also if there are complicated family issues involved, family conflicts, family mental illness, addiction, abuse, those kinds of things will all be a part of this mediator 4, historical antecedents. So mediator 5 is the personality variables of the griever. So age and gender certainly are involved. And I talk about this, we talk briefly in this course about differences in mourning between men and women. And as generations come up, it seems like younger generations, millennials, and younger than millennials, you guys mostly, that you have a more expansive view of gender and gender roles. And so I think that those gender differences will become less. They will become less noticeable and in the future. But for right now, there are some differences, mostly culturally imposed, on how men and women, male and female, grieve and their grieving styles. And age, developmental age, also has a role to play. And we will talk more about that in weeks to come when we talk about children and grief and aging and grief. Whatever the individual's coping style is, are they a problem solver? Do they attack things head on? Do they avoid? Do they You know, are they active in emotionally coping? Do they go to task oriented things? Whatever your coping style is, it's going to show up in your grieving style. And your attachment style that we talked about in terms of the attachment that the griever had with the loved one who's deceased, but also how you are generally disposed to attach with others, whether secure, insecure, avoidant, those kinds of things. Cognitive style. Are you generally a positive person? Do you approach things with the glass half full? Are you optimistic, or are you mostly negative or ruminating about things, or somewhere in the middle? Your ego strength. Do you have a strong sense of self? Do you have good self-esteem and good feelings about yourself and your abilities, or do you have a lower sense of self-esteem? And assumptive world, which is what I talked about in that task 3 adjustment. What are your beliefs and values and your outlook on life? What are they and how strong are they? Mediator 6 is social variables. And the first one in social variables is support satisfaction. So when we look at people and we have a client and we're able to identify, you know, all these different sources of support, we have to take into account whether that, you know, person, whether our client or whether we are feel comfortable accessing that support. So, yeah, that hence the name support satisfaction. We could have, you know, a great faith community, or, you know, work friends or family, or, you know, neighborhood. But if we don't feel, you know, comfortable in accessing that, then the support satisfaction is not there. The other part of this is we could have a lot of people that say, yeah, you know, just tell me what you need. I'm here for you. I'm here for you. Tell me what you need. And then you say, well, I really need this. And they're like, well, you know, I'll see what I can do, or I'll see if, you know, Nancy can help. Sometimes the support that appears to be there is, you know, not as solid as one would think. So perception versus reality, willingness to access versus reluctance. So support satisfaction is an important social variable. Social role involvements. You know, are your social roles dependent on the person that died? Are you a parent and you've lost your child, God forbid? And so all of those connections that you had as a parent with school or with, you know, sports or other things, they just go away? Or the same with a spouse, or most of your support other couples? You know, those kinds of things. So social role involvements are very important in determining, you know, your outcome or your ability to grieve and to move through the mourning process. Religious resources and ethnic expectations. Some cultures, and we will again be talking a lot more about culture throughout our course, but some cultures have an expectation that you will, you know, express outwardly all of your emotions in a very heartfelt and very expressive way. And others are very closed. I am from a very traditional WASPy background where we did not throw ourselves on the casket. We did not, you know, show emotion. If anything, you know, we were very stoic. Any emotion is private, very private. And Some religious expectations are that you have a certain time frame. So in the Jewish religion, you have 7 days of sitting Shiva, and people come and they provide their support, and you express your grief, and then you're done. All that, with that in mind, you also do not place a headstone in the Jewish tradition for a year. So there is that space to, to revisit the mourning process, and then you do have a remembrance. You have and you recite a special prayer on the anniversary of the death every year. So, and that's just one religious expectation, but also a resource, because there are times built in for people to come and provide that support to you. And then an interesting thing that I always bring up is the secondary gains in grieving, which sounds kind of crazy, but there are things like, you might have a project due at work, and your boss says, yeah, I know this is a tough time for you. I can, I'll give you a couple extra weeks. Or, people are bringing food, so that you don't have to prepare food. People are, taking care of your kids so that you can have some space. Things like that, where you get, it's a secondary gain in grieving. And it's an interesting concept, and the one that I never really put a name to before I took this course 20 years ago. Concurrent stressors. So, when a loved one passes away, you might have an elderly couple, and the death may be completely foreseeable. They've been sick for a long time. And so, you've prepared emotionally as much as you can. You're never completely prepared, but once that spouse dies, that couple, that income is cut in half. And yet the expenses are not cut in half. The rent is the same. The utilities are probably mostly the same, insurance, things like that. And so that's a stress. There might be, for some families, depending on the way the death happened, there might be legal fees. There might be unpaid medical expenses. So financial is one concurrent stressor. Another is, as we talked about, as you're taking on new roles, if you have to take on new roles, that is a concurrent stressor. You have to find the energy and the time and educate yourself on what those roles entail. So that's just 2 examples of many that can be considered concurrent stressors. And some also, there might be legal involvement. Like I said, there might be press involvement, depending on, what the motive of, what happened, how that person died. So all of those things go into play in determining, really how that person's, how that mourner is going to approach the loss. So does anybody have any comments or questions about this model, about the Worden? I mean, that's sort of the bedrock of where we go in this course, given, all the other models. It seems to have taken into account a lot of the other models and built on that. Anybody have any comments about that, or does this make sense to you, or you have any questions?
At first, I thought the secondary gains sounded really, I don't know, questionable to me. I'm not
Mhm.
saying there aren't, but I just don't think of it in that way. It just seems more like there's support in a community. But when I think about it, like I'm someone who had that, right? Like I'm someone who had people bring me food. So if you're someone who doesn't have those things, then yeah, it could change your experience, because if you have little kids at home and you're running around, like it doesn't give you the space or time to actually grieve. So I guess it could interrupt in some ways your grieving process if you don't have those types of things. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but that's kind of what it did for me.
And you're right, there is an overlap between secondary gains and support. You know, like in the work example, that, you know, where you get some extra time to finish a project. You know, that is in a sense your supervisor's way of giving you needed support. So yeah, it's just another way of saying it or of looking at it in that respect. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that you know, that someone is somehow taking advantage of the fact that they've lost a loved one, although I'm sure that happens. But it does it more points to a way of getting, you know, more breathing room and alleviating some stress in the grieving process. Yeah. If you had a chance to look at the other models, do you see sort of a progression, or at least how one kind of builds on another, and how Worden kind of encapsulates a lot of the theories of all of those models? And I think in particular that, you know, that it does leave room for growth. One of my favorite models is that Schneider growth and transformational model. And I think that task 4 is very much about that, about taking what has been given to us, or what we've learned from from this experience, from the presence or absence of our loved ones, and you know, what we've been through in those tasks and the experiences, and how we can grow with that. And I think the meaning making, you know, the David Kessler model, his sixth stage of mourning is the or of grief, is the making meaning of it all. And that is not to say, as I said last week in the recorded lecture, that is not to say that, oh, everything happens for a reason. It is to say that we can look at everything and make something of it. For instance, you know, you'll see in my lecture on suicide, with the death of Robin Williams, and of the death of by suicide of the veterans, people use that opportunity to raise awareness about mental health and to try to reduce the stigma of mental health. So meaning making from that perspective, not from, you know, oh, what is somehow higher power trying to teach me from this, but rather, what can I take from this and make things better in the world? How can I make things better out of this horrible situation that happened? And sometimes it's a personal thing. How can I learn to grow? How can I grow from this? I encourage you also to look at the slides and read the handout on companioning model. It very closely resembles Worden's work and builds on a lot of them. I heard Alan Wofelt speak many years ago here in Houston, and he's the compassion in his approach is palpable. He's just one of those people where I left there feeling like I felt cared for, if that's like a very strange thing to say, but I was a hospice social worker at the time, and I had been through this course, and I found the models to be somewhat unsatisfying, that there was something about them that I just couldn't put my finger on, that wasn't how I was approaching my work as a social worker working with dying people and with grieving people. And when I heard him speak, I was like, that's it. It's not that these models don't make sense. It's that maybe my role in all of this did not make sense, or I needed somebody to articulate it better. And so his model of companioning, where we're not there to dictate or to be the person that's leading people through the grief experience. That is mostly when we're talking about uncomplicated grief, but we're there to sit alongside of someone, to be their companion, and to let them go through the experience knowing that there's someone there with their arm around them, going through it with them. And so, there are things that we go through, that we work through, that we travel through as grievers, and as a grief counselor, as someone working with someone, again, mostly working through an uncomplicated grief experience, that role of being a companion is the one that honors the grieving process and the natural part of grieving, the natural nature of grieving, that everyone does it, that it's not a disease, it's not an abnormality, that the things that we go through, as you saw in the materials from last week, all of these things that, you might think, am I going crazy? I'm not sleeping, I'm eating strangely, I'm seeing my loved one, I'm yearning for them, I'm feeling all these different things. No, you're not crazy, you're not abnormal. These are normal things that people go through when someone they love has died, or someone important to them has died. And so that model of normalizing and sitting with and experiencing with and learning from that grieving person, I think is a very powerful companion piece to all of the models that we have been learning about this past 2 weeks. So I encourage you to look into that a little more. Look at the handout. It's just a 1-page handout, and the slides that I prepared about the companioning model. I'm not going through them in detail because they resemble very much Worden's work. It's just in the approach, how he approaches the care of and providing support to grieving people, that is transformational in my view. So I encourage you to explore that as well. And you can Google Alan Wofelt. He's got lots of videos out there, lots of TED Talks. And if you are so inclined, you can travel up to Fort Collins, Colorado, to his Grief and Loss Center, or Center for Grief and Loss, and take one of his $2,000 seminars over the course of several days, and I'm sure it is worth every penny, because as I say, he's a remarkable person. But there are other ways to access his materials as well, and I commend those to you at tonight. So, does anybody have any experience with him or with his model of doing things or his writings or anything? He's got lots of great workbooks. I've used them with grieving people. He has a great coloring book for children that goes through a lot of the feelings and things like that. So, and that is in the bibliography to this the syllabus in this course. So you can probably find that there. So other than that, that is all I have for tonight. Next week, we will not be meeting on Monday night, but we'll be meeting individually. So please sign up for your group. The link is, I think, in the email that I sent all of you this week with your group assignments, and it's also in the course schedule on Blackboard. Any questions about that? Like I said, I'd love it if your whole group could come, but if you can't, at least one representative, please sign up. And also people are signing up for the group presentations on the schedule. So look into that and make sure that you get in there. I do have less groups than I usually do. They're more larger groups this time. So I may require you to only view 5 presentations rather than 6. So I will let you know about that in the weeks to come. You don't need to worry about that until the last week of class. That's all I have for tonight. If anybody has any parting thoughts or questions, I will have office hours on Thursday night from 6 to 7. So you can tune in at this Zoom link. And also, if you need to talk any other time or have questions, just text me and I will set up a time to meet with you. So you don't need to wait until Thursdays at 6.
I was just going to say real quick, I've been listening to a really great podcast. Anderson Cooper has a new podcast called All There Is.
Yes.
I don't know if anyone's listened.
Yes.
And if you're ready for it or interested, it's excellent. And I mean, I've cried, I've laughed. It's really moving and really powerful.
He's really, it's really great. And as a matter of fact, I linked to one of his episodes in the suicide section. It's as bonus material. It's not on any test or anything, but it is very raw. But it's an excellent podcast. And he talks to different celebrities too about their experiences of grief and loss. So thank you.
I have kind of one thought I'd like possibly to share. Hopefully it's not too far off the mark. I admit I'm behind on my readings, but regarding like meaning making, and this is something that hit me the other day out of nowhere. Sorry, my cat's getting ready. But like you said, we tend to, you don't get over it. You learn how to go with it and you carry that on. So I don't remember, like, for example, my mom's death. I kind of want to push that away. I don't want to find meaning in that so much. But the other day, I don't know how it popped up in my head, it just, so many, I was thinking, I guess in psychology, I was thinking about the values, because I was going through some ACT reading that I was doing, and they get into values about that. And so we constantly ask ourselves, what are our values, regarding everything, all these different things, and you list them. And I was thinking, I get my values I got this value from my mom. I got this value from my dad. And in a way, it just ties me closer to them and gives meaning to that. And, you know, yes, she was my mom, my biological mom, et cetera, but I carry that with me. And so when I think, oh, this is something I get, not just a love of, say, classical music or something like that, but, you know, a value of, you know, and I can go on a list right here, but that's a directly from her influence. So I find meaning in that.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way to put it. That it's not how am I changed in like, I like art or something. I mean, that is, or music, that is a very, that's a tangible thing that you can say, how am I different because of my loved one? But a deeper meaning, what are my values? You know, how are they influenced or changed? And sometimes it's in a negative way or a positive way, you know, like that was their values. And so I learned that that's not my values, you know, because I saw how it worked out with them. But that still gives meaning to their life and to their experience and to the, how am I different? How am I changed at a fundamental level because I knew them and because they were in my life. So
they valued education. And now that we're coming up on elections, I remember when I was a child, my dad took me into the booth. This is old timey, and you actually had to pull a lever down. He let me do that.
yeah.
But that's a value. Every time I go vote, I think of that. So
and the curtain came across and back. Yeah. Yeah. And then how do I do the same for someone else? You know, how do I pass that value along to someone else? And the importance of, and we'll again talk a little bit more about this going forward, of story, of telling their story, and how do we preserve their story? And that's all part of meaning making too. You know, what was their story and what is their story, and how do we, you know, bring that forward to others so that their, you know, that their life, you know, carries forward too with us. So you'll listen to the podcast with Rachel Naomi Remen and the importance of story. So
the On Being interview, that's the one I'm familiar with.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, I really appreciate all of you coming tonight, and I hope that you continue to come or watch on video, and that you're getting some good things out of the materials. And we will then see you next week. Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Too.
Thank you.